There we go. I think we're live.
All right, we are live. Um, all right, everybody, welcome to our first AI Copilot Builder Series, where we talk with some of the leading builders of AI copilots and generative AI applications, products, and services. And so, thank you for joining us. Um, we're going to be talking about everything from sort of the user experience around building copilots and generative AI applications to the underlying architectural and technical details, best practices, many of them sort of hard fought, hard won tips, tricks, and hopefully you'll come away with something that's valuable. We will be taking questions at the end if there are any. So we'll try to save a few minutes for that. If you do have a question, you can post it in the chat. Everybody in the audience will actually see your question. So feel free to post questions during the chat. Even if we see it mid-flight, we might even actually answer it on the way. If not, we'll look at them at the end of this talk. So with that general intro, today I'm extremely excited to welcome Paul Blankley, who is the co-founder and the CTO of Zenlytic, business intelligence that you can talk to. And we'll learn much more about what that means in a second. So Zenlytic is one of the most advanced AI copilots that I've seen on the marketplace. It does some really amazing things. Check it out, zenlytic.com or zenlytic.ai. And Paul is one of the builders in this space that I most admire. I've talked to him many times personally and seen him talk more publicly about the opportunities from a product perspective and also the technical challenges and technical design of building AI products and services. So I'm extremely excited to have him to be able to talk a little bit about Zenlytic, what they've built, how they're thinking about it from a user experience and from a technical perspective, and give you all hopefully some wisdom that you can take to build your own copilot if that's what you're doing. So with that, Paul, welcome.
Thanks for having me, and you're far too kind. So I'm excited to be here and excited to chat through what we're doing, both from a user facing and a little bit into the kind of details of just building this stuff that you don't really get from tutorials you see on Medium.
So awesome. So Paul, I know what Zenlytic does. Probably some of our audience does as well, but probably not everybody knows what Zenlytic does. So maybe just to kind of kick things off, you can describe a little bit about what Zenlytic does. Maybe what it does, what it offers users, and then we can take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Zenlytic is a business intelligence platform. What that means is that we compete with tools like Looker, Tableau, Power BI. We offer all the sort of permissioning, dashboarding, scheduled reports, the traditional sort of BI experience that you need. That has a place, and that's really useful for reports that recur. The place where we're really innovating and using, our AI copilot, which we call Zoe, the thing we do really uniquely well is have this talk to your data experience. In my experience working with data, a lot of the actual data needs are not recurring stuff that you need to get every week or day. They're just ad hoc questions that come up and you just need a quick answer to. And that's what I find most data teams are bottlenecked with. And that's what we're trying to solve with Zoe, our AI chatbot or AI copilot.
Cool. And I mean, I think that gets to actually something when I talk to anybody who's building a copilot, there's this immediate question on like, are you building, I mean, worst case, are you building sort of, what do they say? Clippy, Microsoft Clippy? Are you building a chatbot? Are you building a kind of a copilot that is more of something that sits by you and is sort of this expert? Is it more conversational? Does it bleed into the rest of the product, right? So is it just, ChatGPT attached to your application? Or is it something that's more infused in different modalities? The autocomplete. I mean, I know I've seen some of the demos and seen how Zenlytic works. So I know part of the answer here, but I guess how do you think about sort of building the generative AI powered product and this idea of a copilot or an assistant, Zoe? I guess you give it a persona in your product. Sort of what is the primary user experience that you have and that your customers actually that's working, I guess. What's working and what's not? Where are you most excited from a product user experience perspective?
Totally. I think from a user experience perspective, we really try to make sure that the AI component is deeply baked into the product. And the reason for that is that we really have to be an AI native product. Like, you shouldn't have, sort of grungy work that you have to do in the product. You should have an AI assistant that can help you do different actions and also do net new things. So a good example of that is that a lot of the times you'll have people that they have an ad hoc question that comes up. You can ask about that. interact, talk with your data using kind of a mix of graphical and just text-based to ask it to do stuff for you. So you sort of mix these modalities. And then from there, you can also interact with other parts of the app by saying, hey, make what we just talked about into a dashboard. And then Zoe, the assistant, will go and make that into a dashboard for you. And so you can interact with different parts of the product through this system. So we really try to make sure it's something that touches all different components of what we do as a platform. And you'll see as we continue building that more and more of effectively everything that you can do in Zenlytic, you'll be able to do with an assistant Zoe to help you.
And what do you, I mean, one of the exciting things is you can have so many ideas of different ways to like leverage these large language models and these capabilities inside of a product. I mean, kind of reimagine the whole product. But I mean, if you just look at what your users are doing, I see, sometimes I talk to people thinking about building copilots, and it's very much like, well, I'm going to automate an action, right? I'm going to, create a dashboard, by typing in, let's say text a dashboard or something like that. And then there's all this other one, use case, which honestly is kind of the core ChatGPT use case, which is more like information retrieval or answer engine, like this, you said ad hoc, questions, sort of from a user value perspective, because I think we're all sort of super excited by the technology, and then but there's still this like, how do we make it deliver value to users? Have you seen something in terms of, hey, this is where I see, people try it, then they try it again, then they use it, then it becomes a habit for them. Maybe some other areas, maybe where, hey, it's not actually that useful. So I guess one is, is there one kind of modality or kind of type of use case that you think customers, people should really focus on from a customer experience perspective, delivers value, and maybe one that doesn't or hasn't so far been as effective?
Totally. And I think if you're thinking about building a product like this, you've got to really think through the use case. Like, not just, can I stick something ChatGPT-esque into my application, but what is sort of the optimal use case here? So, for us, I'll put it in two buckets. There's one area where Zoe's not super helpful because honestly, the best modality is a dashboard. If you need to receive, reporting on SKU sales every week, the best experience is to have that show up in your email, on a schedule, and have everything you need in that report. And you don't have to go to a tool. You don't have to ask anything. It's just right there for you. That actually is the best experience. Conversely, right now, most ad hoc questions that are asked of a data team get in this queue that lasts for weeks. Right. You don't get the answer you want. That is the modality where Zoe is just incredibly useful. And the reason for that is that because when you actually think about the workflow, the best possible, answer to that is I ask an ad hoc question. In a few seconds, I have someone with all the context on my data, knows how to calculate my different metrics, knows, when the pipelines were run, how often things are used. They have all the context that I don't on the warehouse. I'm able to go ask them a question. They come back in seconds with all of that context, help me work through, maybe what I asked wasn't what we have. What do we have that's close to what I asked? Handle that back and forth, and then give me the data I need. And if you can do that process in a few seconds, I would say that is the optimal, like, ad hoc data question experience. Everyone likes the talk to the person on the data team, except for the fact that it takes forever.
Right. It's always
the process of being able to refine what you need is so essential that's why people don't really use BI tools. Because if they need to go through that process, they can't do that. They cannot go through that process with a software system outside of using Zoe, basically.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's an interesting insight of, like, if you do have that extra expert person on your team, a human, right, who knows all that context and has the bandwidth to actually answer your question, that's actually this like, hey, Susan, like, can you please give me the ARR over blah, right, is actually a pretty, is better than hunting around in a Tableau dashboard, because, you have some, instant question that you're, or ad hoc question that you have for some meeting that's coming up, or some decision that you're about to make. And then, having that expert is how we, it is a good experience. Now, most organizations and most data teams are way overburdened. And so I can see, that sort of that conversational interface for that ad hoc use case, which is a dominant use case, certainly in analytics, would be effective. I think one question, I mean, maybe to go a little bit deeper on there, is like, it matters, if it's an expert, right, and you're talking to an expert and they do a good job, it's great. And if they give you the wrong answer, it's pretty bad. So I guess where are we in terms of, your sense for, is it on this sort of expert to, not expert, does it work, right? What's the reliability like for this type of, I think we can all imagine sort of the type of questions that you would ask an analytical system like Zenlytic. Is this something that works out of the box with today's, models, or sort of what are the challenges that you're facing to deliver that kind of ad hoc question answering experience over a kind of pretty complicated data in most organizations?
Oh yeah, immensely complicated data, I would say. I think the thing to get at here, which I would also think about if you're, designing or building Copilot, is you really got to get the architecture right. And by architecture, I really mean the guardrails in which the AI system works. Because you can, design these systems to work in any myriad of ways. So probably the most common approach, which you'll see a lot of YC companies doing, is something called text to SQL. They're basically going to read all the tables in your database, throw in a prompt from ChatGPT, maybe do some nice prompt engineering to try to get that, working well. It's going to then spit out a SQL query, show you an answer that may or may not be right. If you've ever seen an actual enterprise data warehouse, there is no chance that that works. I'm a pretty expert data person,
Yeah.
at pretty much every customer we onboard, there's like 4 to 5 different tables that all have something invoice in them. I would have no idea which of those is the right one to use, how I would calculate the invoices. Do we include the closed ones or not? There's just so much logic and so much context that no matter how intelligent you are or talented you are, and GPT is good, but it's not, human expert level yet, how would you perform well? So our answer to that is what we call our semantic layer. So these are like guardrails for how the LLM system uses your warehouse. And there's 2 kind of main benefits you get from that. The first one is just accuracy. It's like these metrics get really complicated. There's a lot of logic you have to apply to just calculate something that seems simple like ARR. And you can apply that logic deterministically, where you basically tell us, hey, this is how I want to aggregate ARR. You can't aggregate it this way. You can do it this way. This is the logic for how I want you to calculate that. Once you define that input, Zoe can then use it with anything else where it's possible to, join in and slice that data. But it's like the abstraction has to be right. You've got to be able to give inputs to the LLM that it can use without, getting so confused that the user has no idea, no way to tell if the answer is right or not. So the first benefit is accuracy. The second one is security. It's like absolutely paramount in data. There can be no chance someone, can see social security numbers or emails that they shouldn't be able to see. You have to be able to apply permissions deterministically. And you can only do that with a semantic layer system like we have effectively. Because then you can define these permissions for who should see what. And no matter what the LLM tries to do, there is a deterministic set of, what you're allowed to see being applied. So I'd say the accuracy and security are really derivative of the guardrails, the infrastructure that we put around the LLM, not so much the LLM itself.
And when you're describing guardrails, I mean, it sounds like what you're describing there is a little bit like a very well-defined API that's designed, sort of a back-end skill, but that's exposed as an API, but it's written in a way that's really thinking about how an LLM would consume it, maybe not how an application would consume it generally, or not going so far and being kind of unrealistic, I guess, and doing this sort of text to SQL approach, right? Maybe it generates a SQL, gets it right, 70% of the time, but honestly, the user probably can't even debug it themselves because they might not know the answer is which invoice table to use. Do you think maybe just in terms of the API design, I mean, is that a big part of, one question that we often get from customers is like they have an existing API, right? And they say, okay, let me take this, open API spec and just throw it at the, LLM, and that's the skills and do you find that works, or do you tend to say, no, you sort of need to like carefully curate a set of skills and APIs, for the LLM?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think right now you really have to curate it, because these models are good at certain things, but they are not, sort of generally intelligent. It's like if you use them a lot, like I have or like our team has, you'll see that they are fine-tuned to do certain things very well in certain patterns. And if you follow those patterns, it's going to perform really well for you. If you try to get it to do stuff that it's sort of not fine-tuned to do well, then you're probably going to struggle. So part of that design process is just this iterative, you've got to have a pretty good architecture to begin with that's sort of designed to work with these systems, make things as simple as possible, don't have duplicate concepts, sort of good programming practices generally,
Right.
but keep things as simple as possible just architecturally, and then just sort of figure out, hey, as you're working with the model, what does it want to do? Because you'll kind of see it miss or like do things incorrectly in consistent ways. And then it's like, okay, maybe instead of trying to get the model to change, we should just change the API and let it do what it wants to do because it's been fine-tuned to behave in some sort of way. So I think a big part of the development is going through that just iterative process of, hey, it's failing in the same way over and over again. Can we design the API to maybe be more like what it seems to want to do or seems to want to
Yeah.
use?
I mean, one kind of related question that has come up, when I've seen people designing these systems is sort of, and we can just talk about this at a sort of a high level, without kind of giving away maybe any secret sauce that you might have here, but sort of this, does like I could build a very complicated chain, right? So Lang chain started with all this complicated chaining, and you build these, sort of like you build these skills that are very complicated and kind of manually to bring a lot of human expertise into them. And then there's sort of this other one, the other kind of area where you're building these little kind of skills and kind of then training or helping the AI sort of know how to use them in a more sort of dynamic way, maybe reduces reliability. Or I mean, I've seen sort of there's pros and cons to both of these approaches. I guess, do you just have a general view on sort of like, should I be spending a lot of time, building complicated chains? Is it a mix? Is it, yeah, any thoughts on this sort of general idea?
Totally. I think the abstraction you pick matters a lot. Generally, it's better to pick smaller, sort of atomic building blocks. And we've worked really hard to design our semantic layer to adhere to these kind of practices. A big part of it is also going back to the fundamentals. It's like, what are people going to ask about, and how do I make those building blocks as clear as possible? So some building blocks for us are, if you're familiar with the BI space, a dimension, which is just like a column in the data warehouse, and a measure, which is like an aggregate, like the sum of revenue or something like that. Those are really good building blocks because that's the kind of stuff users ask about. ARR is a measure and plan type is a dimension, and someone could very, easily say, hey, I want, all of the ARR from plans that, these type of plan types that signed up in the last 3 months or something like that. Very reasonable, very useful question. Since we've worked really hard to make the semantic layer such that the LLM can just say ARR, plan type, last 3 months, and get an answer back, it actually works really, really well. The problem is most other tools on the market, haven't defined their semantic layer like that. So if you look at even a very good semantic layer like LookML, they have this intermediate concept of explorers. That's hard because there's duplicate information in the explorers, and which one does the LLM choose? Who knows?
Right.
So it's like, it's hard to get that infrastructure right, but it's really, really important to being able to have a system that actually can work well with an LLM.
Yeah. No, I mean, that matches my experience. And so it sounds like, I mean, you kind of, we were talking about challenges generally in, even from a user experience perspective. And actually you kind of went to this architecture drives the user experience, because I guess if you don't get the architecture right, the user experience falls apart, which is true. I mean, when reliability falls apart, or it's, you ask the same question two ways, right? That it hits two reporting APIs that give you different answers, or, you're generating SQL and the SQL is, not consistent, the user experience, can really suffer. I guess from just staying a little bit more at the user experience perspective, are there any other challenges that you've seen, or sort of things that you think are, hey, you really need to pay attention from a user experience perspective when building a copilot or an assistant?
One of the biggest ones that I don't think people talk about enough is a kind of transparency or auditability. So whenever the LM gives you some sort of answer, you should be able to check whether that answer is right or not. So I think actually ChatGPT is a pretty good example of this done well, because it just outputs text. If you can read the language that it output, you can understand what it output. It may or may not have outputted something useful to you, or may not have outputted like what you wanted, but you know what it did. Whereas a lot of these tools that are, generating code, especially generating code for people who can't, code, can't audit the code that it's generating, they have no idea if it's right or not, and no way to check if it's right or not. So whatever you're doing, if you're, moving things around on a PowerPoint, if you're, generating text, if you're performing API actions, there's got to be a feedback loop where the user can
Yeah.
be like, okay, this did what I wanted. Okay, I asked it to turn that thing green. The thing is now green. That makes sense. It's very, very logical. If you don't have a feedback loop like this, then I find it's very, very frustrating for users because they're just sort of like, I asked this thing and I don't even know if it's right or not. Like, this doesn't make any
Yeah.
sense. So thinking through that feedback loop is really, really important, and making sure that you structure your outputs in such a way that whoever your target user is can actually, discover if the answer was right or not, or helpful or not, because it's never going to be 100% right.
Yeah, no, we found we found the same thing, but it's we've also found that it's also subtle from the UI, the user experience perspective. Like, you absolutely need to show what you're doing, show a sense of progress, which actually gets to latency as well, which we should
Totally.
chat about because I know we've talked about that. But then you don't want to overwhelm the user maybe with too many bells and whistles. I mean, one of the beauties of ChatGPT is, it gives you the answer, right? And if you have these big citation cards that are right in your face, but you just wanted the answer. Sometimes you can it can actually degrade the experience. And so you need the citations, but then even just the you really have to work with what I've found is you really have to work with your UI designer to make sure it is what the user wants. And honestly, the user expectation, as they may change a little bit over time.
Oh,
But
totally.
I definitely agree. I mean, especially as these systems do more and more, or they answer more and more critical questions, which in your domain is there's a lot of critical questions, and you want to understand why. Showing your work, or at least having the ability to see how the work was done, is very, very important to kind of building trust in the business context. I mean, yeah, maybe touch on, because I know this sort of progress, kind of progress indicators also are a good way to mask latency. And I know that's come up, we were chatting in the past about, our experiences with latency and how actually that's important for user experience. But yeah, any thoughts on just this kind of sort of latency, answering quickly versus maybe quality of the answer, and how you kind of trade those things off, or what's kind of what you've learned there?
Yeah, I think it's the tough thing is that it's not something you can trade off. It's got to both be fast and it's got to be right. So you really do need both. And a lot of that is just figuring out what can you do behind the scenes that's going to enable you to be right and be fast. Um, the being right is more specific to your application. It's just like, what are you doing? What checks that take a long time could you do faster? And how could you do them faster? The being fast is one where you've really got to do streaming. I don't think there's really a way to build a copilot now that's going to be even a reasonable user experience that doesn't involve streaming. And the thing is, it's just like, for generating any kind of meaningful output, it's going to take so long that if the user's not seeing progress, they're going to think it's broken. So
Yeah.
you've got to have a way to handle streaming, and you've got to have a way to handle really pretty long running tasks. I mean, some of these, streams can take a minute, 2 minutes, like long enough to where if you're just holding a, browser web request open, it's going to time out. So you got to have an actual system for streaming these back, for having long running tasks that don't clog up your back end. And that's another thing that I don't really see show up in a lot of tutorials of people, showing you kind of how to get started building a copilot.
Do you have a rule of thumb? I mean, it's interesting you mentioned, minute, which is hopefully at the end, hopefully until the complete response happen. I mean, but, versus sort of, I think there's like one, time to first token, or time to first, I mean, it might not even be a token in a richer user experience, right? We're not just text. A lot of your copilot has, rich responses that are plots and, everything in it, which, your kind of toy copilots or toy assistants don't have. But I'm curious, do you have a sort of a rule of thumb? I mean, just having, vibe check in terms of, how fast these things should start responding to users, and sort of what, that makes it a pleasant experience versus maybe a frustrating experience?
I think as fast as possible, like, you should start showing the first token. So whatever the concept is that you can show the first, show that. So like for us, most of the, first step that we're doing is doing some sort of, figuring out what is in their data model that could be related to what they're asking about. So that process, we're sure that we stream, we form
Progress.
a UI component as soon as it is possible. And that happens, sometimes in a second, sometimes second to 2 second, something in that sort of low single second range is generally good. And then as you're making progress, the user should have more things that they're able to do, basically. So they should be able to see, okay, how have I made progress so far? okay, I've got that. Now it's doing something else. And then they can sort of digest the information as it's coming in, as opposed to just having to sit there and wait and then digest all the information once it's completely done streaming. So basically, as soon as you can iteratively build UI components, start building UI components.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's honestly one of those things like, you experience it and you realize it. I think we've shipped an engineer, figures out some trick to make it seem faster. And I don't think it's a big issue. And then I see it and I'm like, wow, this completely changes the experience. So yeah, I mean, if you're building a Copilot out there, I would say just think about latency, masking latency, showing being fast. It really does make a huge difference from the experience. It's sort of like whatever this, Amazon lesson of where every 100 milliseconds, reduced sales by 1% or whatever that famous lesson is. There's probably a Copilot lesson that will be, engagement is extremely highly correlated with the latency of the response, or time to first token, and then probably, time to first token or time to first sort of meaningful, hey, I'm comfortable that the system isn't broken and it's making meaningful progress. Seems to really matter. I mean, somewhat related actually, sort of to this latency question is, with this kind of question answering response, we're all in a world where things, we anticipate things to come back reasonably quickly. So we have this analogy with, doing a Google search or something like that as a sort of best in class. But there's other type of work, right, that is, just inherently going to take a long time. And I don't know if that is relevant in your world. But I can think of like this interest in agents and autonomous agents, and kind of moving from co-pilot to co-worker. This is a little bit aspirational at this point, but how do you think about that? And as you think about your product evolution, the user experience, the value you can deliver to your user, what's feasible technically, sort of this idea. How bullish are you on this sort of idea of moving beyond just kind of a little assistant, or maybe just dramatically expanding the scope of what this thing can do, where it can go off and I don't know, just do a whole compile the whole board, the whole board deck or something like that. That at least in our minds, well, humans can do it, right? So but we haven't yet seen examples of AIs doing that. So how do you think about this topic of autonomous agents, or just agents in generally?
I think it's generally just kind of like a progression. So I would say, like, from our perspective, we're a very, very human centric product. Like, we're going to do everything we can to make our user, the star, make them feel like they got all the stuff they needed faster and faster. I do think that includes a natural progression to doing more kind of planning or like high level stuff. So like, I think an example is, right now you could say, hey, go get me the list of all accounts that have over 100K in unpaid invoices. It's going to go grab that list for you. Great. And then you could say, hey, draft an email to Joe or whoever has the, most unpaid invoice that I can send to them. It's going to draft that email for you, include all their invoice details that you would want to include in the email. Great. That's super helpful. At some point, our system and other systems like ours are going to just sort of gradually, I don't think it's like a switch where it's going to be like oh, great, it's just running off doing its thing. It's going to be, okay, I want to now go from drafting email to every account, like go and draft all the emails. And then, actually every month I want to, set up a schedule where you're going to go pull maybe like all of this whole list, draft emails to all of them, and then just send them all. So, at some point, I think the systems are going to get more and more automated, but they've got to be sort of assistants for the humans first, because you've got to build so much trust that you're never going to, mess something up, especially something as sensitive as asking for money that hasn't been delivered yet. So, it's got to be really, really bulletproof before even the humans using it would even think about trusting it to be, fully autonomous. So I think it very much is a like progression. It's going to be like, get you the plots you need for your board deck. Then it's going to be able to get maybe the plots in one shot. Then it's going to be able to get the plots and maybe put them in a PowerPoint for you. And, it's going to sort of progress like that, where it can just incrementally do the next thing. And you can just ask less specific questions and get really good outputs. So that's kind of how we think about it. Is that it's more of like a continuum.
Yeah, no, I think that isn't it. And it's an interesting example. This sort of loop example, do 100 tasks, right? And then send 100 emails or something like that. If I think about, some of the value I've seen is, it's kind of what are the tasks that currently humans do that take a fair amount of time? And in your domain, this ad hoc question coming in from the exec to the data team and compile the report, it's, carve out a couple hours of your day probably to actually do that and then draft the response. And then you shrink that down to, seconds, maybe a minute max, right? 30 seconds or something to get your full answer. They're kind of a dramatic reduction. Sometimes these, for a little like, hey, if it's just send one email or just, mark this task as done, right? It's probably not, it's hard to get, much faster than just clicking a button. But I think these bulk actions, it is an area where, I think I've, in the CRM space, if you say like, go and summarize, all the deals that are currently open and which ones need a follow up and, tell me the best follow up to do or something like that. You can think of how many clicks, if you task somebody on your team to do deal review, right? Like deal review is a common thing in sales organizations. It's just a lot. So I do think this, it's very exciting to see where this will go, but it's true. I haven't seen many examples of it working today. The reliability, if it doesn't do it well and it sends out the wrong emails or puts in bogus notes, not very good experience. So, it'll be interesting to see where that all goes. Maybe this is an opportunity to kind of go a little bit away. And we've already talked a little bit about some of the technical details, but a lot of our audience are people building copilots, thinking about trying to make these great copilots great. And you have a lot of lessons that you've learned in building Zenlytic. I think you've talked about them a little bit, but I mean, maybe just if you think from a technical perspective about some of the top challenges that you've had technically. You mentioned architecture already as being kind of a critical a piece of that, getting that architectural element right. But are there anything else from a technical side that you kind of think people should that you've had either as a challenge that you overcome or an ongoing challenge?
Oh, totally. So on the architecture thing, the one other thing is I don't think you're ever going to find the right one to begin with. That's the sort of nature of the beast. You've just got to start and be as rigorous as possible with testing it, figure out where it's failing, what you need to re-architect to make it work better. This is like a constantly iterative process. So don't be discouraged basically if you start building something like this and it doesn't work, because that's the demo. A good demo is very easy to show. A good product is very, very hard to build, and that's going to require a lot of re-architecting, a lot of figuring out how to make complicated stuff work well under the hood. The other thing that I'd add is like testing and evaluation is super, super hard right now for LLMs. There's no real good products yet for this. And I see a decent amount of these products. I'm the primary, like I'd be a great purchaser of these products. And, there's nothing really good yet in like testing or evaluation. Either the two areas that I'm really interested in are testing kind of like generally like end-to-end sort of testing, but driven in a non-deterministic environment where people can input stuff that I never thought of in 100 years into the system, and it goes, and most of the time it does stuff pretty reasonably, but sometimes it doesn't. And if you have these just very, very wide scope of inputs that people can ask, it's hard to do testing well for that. And I am looking for better solutions there. The other one is evaluation of the actual system. It's like, hey, we've got gold standard. We've got, this is how, the system should be working. And that evaluation is hard. Like there's not a lot of good products out there that help you make that process easier. And a lot of that is stuff that we've, had to roll ourselves internally or, just do manually sometimes. Like it's just a hard part about building these systems right now. So it's a really important part, but that's one of the big sticking points.
And sorry, so when you use the term sort of testing and evaluation, how do you, I mean, maybe you could just kind of dive a little bit deeper in terms of what you mean by that term. Is it unit, testing, I think unit tests, pass, fail, evaluation, I think, hey, maybe a fuzzy numerical value that comes out and I don't know, make a subjective decision on whether look if it's better than the past. Or are you talking about something else in terms of the life cycle of the model or the type of tests, you mentioned sort of more heterogeneous tests in one case. How are you thinking about, how do you think about these two terms, testing and evaluation? We are in a very non-deterministic world here. So compared to traditional software engineering. So curious on what you've learned about what those terms mean and the kind of what you've learned about the differences there.
Yeah. So I think evaluation is very much, you have a big data set of how, you want the system to respond to people. And you go and make changes to the system. You just want to make sure that it is performing at some level of accuracy, that you haven't screwed things up, basically. you should be able to run that in CI whenever you're, doing things. If you're making changes to the system, run it just in development to make sure that you're actually improving things, because the system is so non-deterministic. And then Trevor hopped in the comments with exactly what, I basically want for the testing side of things. The testing side of things, evaluation kind of tests the known,
Yeah.
things. The like, how is it going to do? Like these are the things I want it to do well on. Are we still doing well on these? Are we doing well on these other things we weren't doing well on before? It's kind of like the known stuff. The area I think of software testing, generally speaking, and LLMs specifically, is using AI to actually provide the inputs. Like I wanted to throw stuff in there that I would never have thought of, that is not in our evaluation set because I didn't think of it and no one on our team thought of it, and it's just completely out of left field. But that kind of stuff happens in reality. So I think if once those systems get pretty mature, like, I mean, I want to be able to test our entire application like that, not just the, chat component, where you can just generate user flows that happen through your application, that are just net new. You could have an AI system discover a bug that no customer has hit yet, just because it's used the product in a way that literally nobody else has. And that is super exciting for just making quality happen without writing a ton of code for tests. So
yeah, no, that is super exciting. I mean, that is a great question. Yeah, this idea, I mean, I think you can even take it even potentially further. So first step is to get, to do the evaluation and sort of drive tons and tons of scenarios, especially with these systems where we then, these interconnected system where you're sort of somewhat validating them, I guess, or you're talking to APIs and you're getting results back. Yeah, you can potentially learn a lot there. I do think, there's a next step that's potentially, happening, which is how do you then feed that back into improvement, right? Where you see a failure, totally. And then is there a way, well, I mean, right now it's, engineering prompt or, whatever it is to fix that problem. But, you could imagine a scenario where you might even be able to do some automation in terms of whether it's fine tuning or other types of training, broadly defined. I guess one to play off of Trevor's question a little bit more, actually, one thing, so, here you're talking about the inputs driven by AI, sort of a version of synthetic data. It almost reminds me of fuzzing, like a next generation version of like fuzzing from a testing perspective. There's also the actual, outputs, and, you generate all these new outputs. Well, are they good or bad, right? Especially if they're not known scenarios, right? So you're generating these synthetic scenarios, then you get some generated outputs. Now you need to say, did it work or not work? A couple fine. If it errors, it didn't work, but in many cases, it's more of a subjective decision. How do you think about model graded versus human graded, golden versus kind of golden records? I mean, have you had success, or have you tried model graded, sort of evaluation where the LLM itself sort of evaluates the output, or does that battle card, kind of head to head between two versions and says which one's better? Sort of this LLM is the judge versus the human is the judge, because I know that is a big topic in evaluation right now.
Yeah, I think at one point you've probably got to get to where some sort of LLM system can be the judge, and it's not necessarily like does one have to be better than the other. It's just like, are these serviceably close? Like, is this saying the same thing? Because that's sort of a lot of the problem that I've run into in our own, trying to test stuff. Is it's like it can say the right thing. It can just say it with different words that weren't in the, thing that you're trying to test, So a lot of, just basic stuff where it's just like responds to you, asking you a follow-up question. It could just reword it differently and still do perfectly fine. Like the system could work perfectly well, but if that test fails or gets a lower grade just because it worded it differently, as long as it's still equally clear to the user, or like effectively the same thing, then the system should get the right grade. And that's really, really hard to achieve. So you can for sure do it in human eval, but then you have, a team of developers who you're paying a lot of money to like work on the system, spending their time just sifting through, answers that are largely the same. So I'm pretty excited about more automated systems there, because I think the other thing is you just want a general feel for like, is it better or is it worse? And if you can't get the scale of like, hey, these are all, this is a batch of 100 questions or something. This is a batch of 50 questions. How do we do? Do we do pretty much the same as before? Do we do way worse? Do we do way better? It's just, you want to be able to get feel for that really quickly without having to have humans go through this really laborious testing process.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I think, I think there is to this testing evaluation. I think one thing we've seen is we added a lot of tests, and then the tests failed. Like every LLM test is a flaky test, and
Yeah, exactly.
it's not the best developer experience. So it's important to have these tests that are pass fail for some very critical things, right? Where you really are saying something's wrong with the system if I don't generate that. But in a different world, it's very much this sort of fuzzy, is it better, right? And you're not going to have perfection, and sort of seeing that you're making constant improvement. I think Greg Brockman, I think at OpenAI said, evals is all you need, or something. There was some tweet along those lines, which I think there is, as you do more and more of this, you realize how far you can get with that. Just, hey, do I get a sense that I'm making forward progress? I mean, to switch gears, evals is a huge topic. I'm sure we could spend the whole time talking about how to do evals. I mean, but just kind of, with sort of 10 minutes left here, 10 maybe a few other topics that I know come up a lot. One that I hear a lot is, OpenAI today is in a very dominant position. Maybe it's changing week to week with the, Gemini 1.5. It was quite exciting for folks who are tracking that at Google. Well, I guess they haven't fully released, but at least talked about some of the metrics that they were getting there. But currently, OpenAI is quite dominant. And I'm curious, I mean, there's really actually two questions here that I sometimes see. One is, should you sort of bet on one model like OpenAI? Like when you think about your architecture, should you sort of say, okay, I'm going to go all in on OpenAI, sort of, assume that, just make that decision, and be willing to lock myself into that, right? And even with the assistance API, for instance, OpenAI, for those in the audience who know, has a sort of a chat completions API, which essentially everybody has cloned. All the open source model providers have a version of it. And it's very easy to kind of switch between different versions, even if it's not exactly the same between the completions endpoint. But then they also offer this assistance endpoint, which is more of a fully managed or partially managed, but a little bit more black box system where you can't, there's no way really to flip out a model inside of that system easily. I guess, how do you think about, two things. One is this kind of, sort of lock in or building on multiple models today, or at least hedging to allow yourself to build and easily switch models. And then a second part of that, we can treat this separately, is sort of this, huge open source, closed source, proprietary question. Do you, at what point do you kind of really want to say, I need to own the model and have full control over everything, where obviously open source shines, versus maybe that doesn't really matter to the end user. So, I mean, maybe we could start with the first, which is really just a question of like thinking about this multiple model world. Is it something we care about? Model routers, are in the mix here, to even dynamically switch between models. How do you think about that from a strategic and architectural perspective?
I think from an architectural perspective, I have no problem with lock-in, actually. The thing I think that matters the most is composability. So it's like, we're an AWS shop. We use Amazon Web Services as our cloud provider. That I think they are amazing because the composability is incredible. If you ever find a service that you don't love at Amazon, you just go to the 2 Amazon services that make it up, and you use those and customize them however you want. And you can just keep doing that all the way down to EC2, basically. That composability lets you kind of get whatever abstraction is most helpful for you. I think OpenAI's assistance is not that. It locks you into doing things exactly with their APIs. You can't do streaming. You can't sub out a different model. It's a little too restrictive. I would be worried about, building a system just on that. Because maybe they push features, maybe they don't, but it's not composable enough that I can break that system up, build the components myself if I ever don't want the higher level thing that they're doing. So I would think mostly about composability, not about lock-in. On the model quality, I do think there's there is an aspect of, as you're building the product, you are learning whatever model you're using. So if you use GPT-4, if you use Claude 2, if you use, Mistral 7B, like whatever it is that you're using, you're learning how that model works. They all work differently. They all have different kind of quirks. It's like talking to a human, basically, just in the sense that they have different quirks. They have different things that they do, different things that they're good at. They respond in this way. You theoretically could swap out the endpoints very easily, but practically you're probably not going to get very good results doing that, because so much of the work you do as you just work with the model is you kind of learn how it behaves, and you sort of optimize your system to work with that model. So it's not to say that you can't switch or that you shouldn't switch. Yeah, at some point you might need to do some fine tuning thing that OpenAI doesn't let you do, and you've got to switch. But like it or not, as you start to use a model, you sort of build the muscle organizationally to use that type of model.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, do you think what about kind of this idea of using I mean, multiple models. I mean, I see, there's this, some customers I talk to like are very concerned about cost. And so there's kind of this question around, do you always need GPT-4 versus GPT 3.5? So even in the open AI ecosystem, you have this 20-fold difference in price that's between those two models right now. And then, there's some, startups out there that are even kind of trying to kind of say, hey, put a model router in here, even dynamically switch, between models. And I guess, yeah, what's your thought on multiple models, sort of versus just saying, hey, we're GPT-4 top to bottom, or whatever this, the model that you care about is.
I think that could be interesting for like higher scale kind of case, like a consumer case. I think for consumer, it's going to matter a lot. Like cost is going to matter a lot because you're serving just a massive amount of people. I think for enterprise products though, quality matters so much. Like, you can like enterprises would way rather pay you a lot more money and have the product work a lot better than pay you less money and have the product work less well. So basically, you want the highest quality system you can possibly get. And if you've optimized for that, then you can write your ticket. Like, like charge what you need to make that work for you, basically. Because if it really works and it really kills it, people like it's just that useful. So I think optimizing for cost is the wrong approach if you're in enterprise, because you just need it to work as well as possible. Not in every scenario. There's you can use 3.5 for some sort of minor tasks and stuff, but generally I would say optimizing for cost in enterprise is the wrong approach. In consumer, I couldn't say.
No, that makes sense. I mean, to hit on another kind of top, we did open, kind of the open source or, the model question that always gets asked. I mean, another question I think that always gets asked is sort of, RAG, retrieval augmented generation, sort of other variations of in-context learning, where you basically put data inside of the prompt, versus fine tuning. Right. And I guess, do you have a rubric for deciding between these two? Do you have a take on, fine tuning? Is it too finicky to worry about? Is it, actually critical to kind of get a competitive edge? How do you think about sort of this balance between kind of in-context learning, RAG, versus fine tuning?
I think they're often pitted as sort of like either or options when really they just have different behaviors. Like you kind of hinted at, it's like RAG is very, very useful. And I think it will remain useful for a long time. One of the reasons for that is that when you retrieve something, you can apply deterministic logic to what is retrieved, like user level permissions on what that user should be able to see. If you just find, like if you just say you just magically trained from scratch your own LLM and it had all of these documents in it, and you needed some people to not have access to certain documents, there is no way to make that system secure. They're just it fundamentally, someone will figure out a way to get past whatever guardrails you have and get it to show them the thing that it shouldn't show them. In a RAG system, you can apply that deterministically, simply, and very, very logically. So I think RAG is going to be useful, even just from a security perspective, for a really long time, for injecting new information into the model that needs to vary based on who is accessing it, where the system is, stuff like that. Fine tuning, I think you use to guide behavior. So it's like, I want you to, answer in this way. I want you to use French, commas and periods instead of English commas and periods when formatting numbers. Like these sort of small things, just in like style and how it uses the different tools you have. That's what fine tuning is going to be best for. Whereas RAG is going to be more like you're injecting new information.
Yeah, no, I think that the security question, I think, is, I mean, it's sort of unavoidable. I think it's so true that, one thing that RAG gives you, or just in context learning that gives you, not only does it give you a lot of simplicity, but it also gives you a really crystal clear security story where you can enforce isolation between, each request has its own context, and that context is determined by the permissions of the user. I mean, we could go RAG has, lots of, how complicated you need RAG to be, and re-ranking and different retrievers and all of that stuff. I mean, because we're a little bit low on time, I mean, maybe just one thing that's currently in the news, which is, this long context, this idea that maybe we have a million pair, million token context coming soon, right? So Gemini 1.5 just announced, a million, basically perfect retrieval, essentially perfect retrieval up to a million tokens. And I think they even demonstrated results in the research paper up to 10 million tokens, which is, many books worth of
Oh yeah.
content that is inside of the context. I guess from Zenlytic's perspective, do you think that would make a big difference? I mean, is there some use cases where you could say, hey, wow, this could really drive a whole another set of use cases, or is it, hey, RAG is good enough, and you don't really need that length of the context?
No, I mean, I think the longer context you have, the better. Basically, it's like, in a perfect world, you would stick every single like just kind of like you do with a human, right? It's like you onboard a human to your company, they learn all the metrics and when to use them, and they use them a bunch of different times and get feedback from people on whether they were successful or not in using them, and they get better, and they kind of have the whole system in their mind.
Yeah,
If you can achieve a system like that in an LLM, that would be awesome. And I think you still need RAG though in that system. And so it's like you might not even need to like filter the responses if you have enough tokens, but you still need to apply all the security laws, like the security
sure.
rules that like, hey, this person can't see emails, this person can't see IP addresses. That shouldn't even show up for the LLM to see. So similarly, I think you still need a similar concept just to apply the security, the permissions, who should see what,
Right. So
any
what is
other
that
context you
context? It
have
might be a
like
big
that.
context. Yeah, but there's
Yeah,
right.
no,
There's
so
still
it's like so it's net totally good. Like, I mean, the more you can let the model make kind of a human decision versus just a effectively a recommendation system, just like searching a bunch of stuff and giving you kind of top three ranked results, and then having the model choose from those. I think you'd fix a lot of sort of weird edge errors that way.
Yeah, I think especially I mean, one if the LLM can really reason over that large context. I mean, one of the failure modes that I've seen is there are questions that are just these like that require the whole context, that like something like summarize this entire thing, right? This entire
Yeah.
this call, or we had one customer that we're dealing with that's like what happened yesterday, right? And they and what
Yeah.
happened yesterday in their entire CR, like system of record system, where you think you got to show it everything, and it needs to create a summary of an incredibly large amount of information. There's not an obvious RAG approach to, okay, what record do I look up to answer that question? And so you either need to build a
Totally.
very kind of an endpoint that kind of does the summarization and then exposes that to the copilot, and then the copilot summarizes that. But there potentially is a lot you could do with a large context, especially if the latency. I mean,
Totally.
I think there are some technical questions around cost and latency for that type of stuff, but it's certainly exciting in a number of domains where I think RAG hits its limits, and these long contexts may open up a whole nother thing. Let's hit on we're coming up to 5 minutes left here to the hour, so let's hit on some real quick ones, kind of lightning round for sort of maybe what's next. And so I guess what's one piece of advice that you would give to a product leader, right? The person who cares about the kind of the customer, in terms of when they're thinking about building a copilot, a generative AI kind of powered product. How should they approach it?
I think really, really thinking through the workflow. It's like, you can stick a chat bot on anything, but you really got to think through what is the optimal workflow here. Like if you could do anything, no constraints, what is the best workflow? Think through that and then try to enable that. Because it's really easy to just see, nice chat workflows or systems that a good workflow is actually a chat kind of workflow, and think, oh yeah, we could just tack that on. Think really deeply through what is the right workflow and then figure out how you can enable it.
Also, I would say if there is anybody who has a question out there in the audience, I'll take one off if we do get one. But I guess on this lightning round, again, one more thing is, I guess if you could offer one prediction for the future, maybe the future is this year, what would it be? In terms of like, hey, we should pay attention to it because it might change the way we build these systems or what we can build. Is there something that you think that you think about?
I'll put a pin in that one and answer Trevor's question he just threw in,
Okay.
which is, how do we think about cost optimization from LLM APIs? And I would get the same like split that I did before, that for enterprise companies, don't worry about it as much. I mean, you can't do stupid stuff. Like you can't, loop through gigantic lists of stuff and run, GPT-4 on them. But as long as your system's, relatively well architected, you just got to provide the best possible experience. And if you provide an amazing experience, enterprises will pay for it. I mean, unless you're, trying to do something like summarizing, 50 million contracts or something, at some point the scale just becomes impossible from a cost perspective. But for most things that I've seen in the enterprise so far, it's like you just really got to focus on getting it right. For consumer, then that's a totally different story. It's like the scale is just unbelievable, and cost is a huge, huge, huge factor, and you can get soaked really fast. I've seen a lot of people with pretty good success from what I've heard. Some engineering leaders who are friends at maybe some bigger companies, more sort of consumer facing, do kind of pilots. Like they'll open up like sort of a beta or something with a small subset of users using one of the LLM APIs, and then say, okay, this is useful, this is good, people like this. Now we got to do like replicate this behavior basically on a cheaper system that we're running ourselves or like our cloud providers helping us run. So that's kind of
right. Take it in steps.
Start
by delivering the experience. You'll have an opportunity to cost optimize. Plus, if the history continues, I guess every 6 months we'll get a 50% cost reduction, just from the underlying provider themselves. That's all great advice. And Trevor, thanks for that question. Last one. I mean, so Paul, thank you so much for joining. Super excited. Super grateful to hear all this wisdom, and hopefully the audience enjoyed it. I guess what's next for Zenlytic? What are you excited about just in terms of what you're offering your customers?
Yeah, so I think we're going to be baking Zoe into more and more, just covering everything that you can do in the app. So we're making Zoe more, pervasive throughout the application. The other thing that I think I'm most excited about is letting Zoe help you configure your semantic layer. So we talked at the beginning around, defining these metrics, and you can define these metrics and then Zoe will use those. But that does involve someone going in and defining metrics. Right now, that process is done very similar to like a Looker, where you're going in, defining these metrics kind of by hand. You're saying like, hey, the sum of this with these filters on it, that's going to be, net revenue or whatever. I think in the future, Zoe will be doing a lot of the work of defining these metrics, and you'll say like, hey, give me revenue. It'll go do something naive, and you'll be like, no, filter out inactives, filter out, returns, filter out influencer orders, filter out, all of these things, you name it. And you can really quickly iterate your way to the metrics you want without ever really having to think about the underlying, structure. So I think that's coming soon, and that is something that I'm really, really excited about.
Awesome. So with that, Paul, thank you so much for joining us. We will be holding more conversations with great people like Paul, talking about how they built copilots and their applications for those that are interested. If you want to check out Zenlytic, if that sounds interesting to you, it's zenlytic.com. If you're building a copilot yourself, or thinking about building a copilot, or more broadly, trying to build generative AI powered products or services, definitely reach out to us, continual.ai, and book a demo. We'd be happy to share more about what we're building, and we'll be announcing more in the coming month or two. Thank you, everybody, and see you soon.
Great. Thank you.